welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Cynthia Weiner has had a long career writing and teaching fiction. Her short stories have been published in Plowshares, The Sun, and Epiphany, and her story Boyfriends was awarded a Pushcart Prize. Recently, her story A Castle in Outer Space was republished in Coolest American Stories 2024. She's also the assistant director of the Writers Studio in New York City. A Gorgeous Excitement, her first novel, is out now and was inspired by her upbringing on New York's Upper East Side in the 1980s and the infamous Preppy Murder of 1986, to which she had a personal connection. Cynthia now lives in New York's Hudson Valley. Cynthia Weiner, thank you so much for joining today to talk about your incredible debut, A Gorgeous Excitement. Publishers Weekly calls A Gorgeous Excitement lush and thrilling. Town and Country says it's absorbing and astute. Kirkus Reviews says terrific debut, carefully paced and beautifully written. This edgy coming-of-age novel succeeds on all counts. Booklist says drawing on her own teen years and the notorious preppy killer of a young woman in Central Park, Weiner incisively captures the timbre of the time, the city's beauty, madness, and terror, the stunning recklessness of young women, and the endless complexities of families. Author Margarita Montemor says a vivid snapshot of a bygone era, an evocative coming-of-age story, A Gorgeous Excitement lives up to its title. And one more, author Alyssa Albert says A Gorgeous Excitement is the rarest blend of charm and suspense, at once delightful and terrifying, an expertly written non-coming of age that also serves as a cautionary tale, this quintessentially haunting as New York itself. So with that, and we could have gone on, what can you tell us about A Gorgeous Excitement?
First of all, thank you so much for having me and for reading all of that, which makes it sound so good. It's so nice to hear. With all that writer insecurity, it's lovely to hear that. So the book is about, it's the summer of 1986 in New York City, and we start the book with a tiny little flash at the end of August 1986 that there's a dead girl strangled behind the museum in Central Park, and we just get that brief flash. A man has been arrested. He said it's an accident. And then we go backwards to June of 1986 and meet the main character, Nina Jacobs, who's this bright, curious, but incredibly insecure 18-year-old. It's the summer before she's heading to college, and she is dying to lose her virginity. And she hangs out at this bar with this, where all of the sort of elite Upper East Side kind of snobby private school people hang out, which she's sort of part of, but also an outsider for many reasons. One, that she's Jewish in a very sort of waspy, preppy world, and another that she has a very ill, depressed mother at home that she doesn't really talk about. Anyway, as the summer goes on, her mother suddenly starts to feel better and starts to seemingly be on the mend. And Nina's introduced to a new super fun friend who also introduces her to cocaine. And the guy that she likes seems to be liking her back. So the summer seems to be on an upswing. And then we start to realize that it's actually going in a very bad direction. But everybody's sort of too involved in their own mania to know that. So That's
And
kind of the
you,
summary.
that's a great summary. And you have a very personal connection with this story, right?
I do. So in the summer of 1986, there was a bar on the Upper East Side where a lot of private school kids hung out, where they still do, in fact. And I spent a lot of time that summer there, as did the person who wound up killing the young woman behind the park, as did she. And that was the bar, in fact, that they left from the night of the murder. And I knew him not hugely well, but pretty well. He was very, very close friends with some close friends of mine. And so I spent a lot of time with him both in and out of the bar that summer. So yeah, and I knew very close up that world. That was a world that I grew up in.
Wow. Um, what was the spark then that started this story for you now, all these years later?
I'd always, obviously, it had always stayed in my mind,
Yeah.
and it had been I tried to write it off and on over the years, as a short story mainly. I tried to write it from the his point of view or the point of view of somebody else. I tried to write it from the present time when he got out of prison, sort of all different ways.
Mhm.
Um, a few things happened. I have four nieces, young women growing up in this world, and I think the older they got, the more I started hearing about their lives and boys that they liked, and just realizing things aren't that different even than they were so many years ago. Um, and in this, political environment, sometimes some things aren't that different. And I also sort of at some point discovered who the main character would be, and that unlocked it for me. That she would be an outsider, and that she would have an ill mother, and that sort of all the facets of her life would mirror this sort of growing excitement throughout that summer, and that brought me to writing it.
Do you remember when you discovered Nina?
Oh, that's such a good question. I guess I was trying to write the book from the point of view, I think it was of the girl who was going to get killed, and I don't want to give anything away, but I was writing different girls. I think that's what it was,
Mhm.
and trying out different um, sort of points of view of who could be the story, who could we see the story through, and somehow she came up and rose to the top. That she wasn't the coolest girl, she wasn't the most inside girl, but her position as being a part became a big part of the story,
Mhm.
and that became so much of the story. And then I realized that I had always felt that way as an outsider a bit, and that was something I certainly knew a lot about, and could tell the story from that point of view.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned your nieces. Um, this is a kind of coming of age story, as we've heard, also about the dangers that young women face and violence against women and victim shaming. Um, we know that these were huge issues in the 1980s. You mentioned some of it is still coming up. How much do you think we've evolved? We seem to think that we've evolved a lot between now and then, but what do you think? What are you seeing with your
Well,
niece?
it's yeah, I mean, it seems like cyclical in a way, doesn't it? Because I feel in the
Mhm.
90s it started to seem, oh wow, real gains are being made, and women, women are, riot girls, and women are really
Mhm.
strong and tough. And you know, my nieces, two of them go to college, and after the recent election, that phrase went around, your body, my choice. I mean, so
Mhm.
in that way, I don't know, girls being punched in the face on the street. I mean, I know you said you live in a city, and I do also, and I heard about that. Um, and just, Roe versus Wade. So I don't know. My nieces tell me when girls get in trouble at school, they're not necessarily believed. By in trouble, I mean when they're victimized at school, they're not
Right.
necessarily believed, and people might speak badly about them, and that doesn't. That's what was happening back then too. So it seems that it's human nature, not some. I mean, the times may go in and out of fashion, certain things, but that human nature might be sometimes to, um, you know, blame the victim or not believe the victim or uh, trust the men more than the women or
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you strike this really wonderful balance in the tone of the novel. In some ways, it is almost this kind of charming, glamorous romp through this wild place in time with this young woman who's coming of age. But there is also this sort of lurking, insidious kind of terror on every page, the danger that we see as the reader, even if Nina doesn't really recognize some of this danger. Was it difficult for you in the writing process to find and strike that balance in tone between the humor and the glamour and the terror of the whole thing?
No, it was a snap. It only took me
Okay,
9
next
years.
question.
No, it is a good question. In fact, I started writing the book. I remember I was actually thinking of this today, and Nina was still a bit of a cipher to me. And I had her, particularly in scenes with her depressed mother. I had her, very anxious and very upset, or in scenes with this boy that she likes. And I sort of, it took me a while to get underneath that, to get to her being angry or her being, sort of funny about her anger, let's say, at her mother, because if one has a depressed mother, sometimes, you might be really annoyed. It's not all just like, oh no, there's that. And there's fear
Mhm.
and there's sadness. There's also annoyance and, liking a boy, there might be all sorts of emotions underneath the main emotion. So it actually did take me quite a while to get to that. I think that was just writing more and more. And at a certain point also, which was really helpful. I'm not sure how I came upon this. I'm sure it was, I read other books too. Um, uh, I started to think about what books did she like to read and what kind of what did she use to distract herself from her own thoughts.
Mhm.
And that's where I came upon, the book of lists, which I loved when I was young. And so
Mhm.
I have her book of lists a lot, and that helped a lot too with the tone. It gave things a bit more levity. I had her thinking about phobias and um, famous last word, which is something I love also. And just so I sort of took all of my interests and kind of I gave a lot of them to her, those things that might be going on in her mind. And I also gave her a new best friend, which I think added a levity to it also. That came a little bit later in the writing, but I think that was very helpful in remembering that no matter what's going on in a kid's life, um, there can be a lot of fun and a lot of humor and a lot of joy, even alongside the darkness. Um, so the book started off much, much, much darker, actually, because I was so connected to what I knew the end was going to be. Um, but Nina doesn't know. I mean, the book is third person, so there is a narrator, but it's very close third person to her, and she doesn't know what the end is going to be. So I wanted to keep that in mind too, with that it's a summer of being 18 for her, and so there is that lightness for her. Yeah.
Yeah. I love the title, A Gorgeous Excitement. Can you talk about
Yes.
where that comes from?
Yes. So there's a scene in the book, the first time that Nina is trying cocaine with her new friend, and she remembers doing which was it, like a drug class, a drug class paper, research paper, in like a 10th or 11th grade. And I think her topic was cocaine, and she remembers reading that Sigmund Freud described a cocaine high as a gorgeous excitement, which in fact is true. He had written an essay called Uber Coca about the wonders of cocaine and how it could make workers work twice as hard and not need sleep and not need to eat. And later he completely reversed himself on these findings, but in the original, he thought it was this wonder drug, and he referred to it as a gorgeous excitement. And the title seemed to fit both for that and also just the way the whole book, the way that, as I said, that kind of excitement, which is also underpinned by that recklessness, but the way it sort of rises throughout the book. So it seemed a good title. I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the perfect title. You mentioned Nina's mother. I feel like this is also a story about depression and drugs, both prescription and recreational, how we medicate and treat ourselves and how we numb ourselves. What drew you to exploring these topics?
Um, well, I did grow up in a family where one of my parents had very severe depression. And so it was something that I had a lot of experience with. And I also experienced when that person felt better. And even if at one point, the person felt better of not great reasons, because of a rising mania.
Mm,
The uh, joy I remember feeling at that time, just because they felt better, even though I didn't care why they felt better, how they felt better, I felt better.
yeah.
I was very involved and close with this parent. So I experienced a lot of that. Luckily, uh, my parent did get better over time and had many good years, but the early years were difficult. So I had that experience as a child of a very depressed parent. Um, and I had the experience of numbing out
Mm.
and trying not to feel a lot of that. So I know from whence I speak. And um, uh, yeah, yeah. So a lot of this did come from personal experience, and understanding why a person is driven to use drugs, why that can feel like an option, how difficult it is to grow up with someone so unhappy. So those are things I really wanted to explore those also. And again, had tried with stories over the years, some
Mm.
more successful than others. Um, but I definitely had approached those topics before. But it was really nice from a writer's point of view to be able to put all of those together with the story from 1986, and to see how it turned out they all fit together really nicely. That was a really happy um, realization.
Yeah. Speaking of your personal experience, the setting in the novel is so vivid and such a huge piece of the story. This very specific world of people in their late teens in the mid 1980s in Upper East Side, New York. And I know you lived it, which is why you're able to sort of put the reader in there with such authority and authenticity. But as we said, it was a while ago. So I'm wondering if there was anything that you did to sort of get yourself back into the headspace of that world.
Yes, I listened to a lot of 80s music, which was really fun research. Most of which I have to say I still had already been listening to, so it wasn't that far reach, but
Because
I
it's
definitely
great.
totally Madonna still holds up. George Michael's. So that was really fun. I did a lot of research about the subways and the city, what it looked like at that time. I mean, I did remember, but it was interesting to be brought back looking at photographs to remember, checker cabs, for instance,
Mm,
which I had sort of forgotten about a little bit, and all the graffiti on the subways, which were just covered in paint. It was incredible to see them, to see them from an adult point of view, and from somebody who, now the subways are at least relatively clean, and the streets are relatively clean. But back in the 80s, everything was just filthy, and it was you just walked through it because that was what it was. So it was interesting to see that from this perspective. It was also interesting to see. I mean, I still love New York. I'll always love New York. I love Manhattan. But in terms of what the streets look like, the stores is very different than it used to be. When I grew up, there were tons of tiny stores,
mm,
the little comic book store and the candy store and the eyeglasses store, or whatever it may be. But Now it feels much more, a little more chain
Mhm.
oriented, a lot of the same stores. So just for the atmosphere, I did some research about that. I did a lot of research about Times Square because I had a scene set there, and
Mm.
I didn't spend very much time in Times Square when I was growing up. So that was definitely, I did a lot of research. The Palladium, where I had been, but definitely wanted to get those details right. So things like that. I did a lot of research to bring me back to that time. Um, I asked friends their memories. Um, and I read a lot of old yearbooks, which was really fun too. I hadn't
Mm.
known was a resource, but if you go onto like yearbook.com, you can find yearbooks going back to like the 30s, maybe
Oh,
even
wow.
longer ago. I know it's really interesting. And even if you go to the school, you can just go on to someone's yearbook. So I went on to yearbooks from the 80s just to remind myself, what did people look like? How did they wear their hair? What were the phrases that people were saying? So that was really fun too. That was an interesting, interesting, a lot of interesting research. So I did things like that. So I used some of my memories and some of my old journals I still had.
Mm.
So that gave me some material, but yeah, a lot of that kind of research.
You dedicated the novel to the memory of your parents. Can you talk about that?
My parents both are deceased, and my mother's been gone for, it's still shocking to me to say, 25 years, and my father for, gosh, 20, 19 years, something like that. Um, I was both extremely close with my parents and at the same time, probably most likely would not have been able to write this book if they were alive.
Mm.
So both. Um, I once heard Lori Moore when she was speaking. Somebody asked her about writing, and she said, "Go home and write the story you'd write if your mother was dead." So, um, but I miss my parents a lot. And my parents were also both great readers. They loved to read. My father, particularly history, biography. My mother loved Shakespeare. She loved poetry. She loved fiction. She loved short stories. She was very, very proud of me for being a writer. She would have been a wonderful writer, actually. I mean, she was a really good writer. And I think that I think I I hope that they would like this book. I think they would, with all the drugs in it and all the other stuff in it. I still think that I think they would be really pleased and to see that I had gotten here. I think they'd be really happy. So yeah, thank you for asking. That's a really sweet question. Thank you.
Well, A Gorgeous Excitement is your first novel, but you're not a newcomer to the literary space. You've published short fiction widely in prestigious journals and magazines. You're a Pushcart Prize winner for your story Boyfriends. And as you said, this novel actually started out as a short story as well. Um, so, how did you know that this particular story needed more room?
Such a good question. And it's funny because I used to not be able to write past 8 pages. Like I just was such
Mm.
a slow writer, so painful. It was torturing over, every single word and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And suddenly this novel is like 300 something pages. I don't know how that happened. But I think, as I said, I tried to write this story in so many different ways, and it just sort of lay there, and was only when I added in the other things that did
Mhm.
expand it into something bigger that um it came alive for me. So I guess at that point I must have realized it had to be longer. I remember at some point an old teacher said to me, "You're writing a novel," and I was like, "No, no, no, I didn't need to do this." Just because I knew it was going to take so long and it was going to be so involved, and it was hard, actually. It was hard to keep all those balls in the air. But now, of course, I'm all excited to write another one because it was fun too. I mean, there was a lot of fun to it. Um, but I think, yeah, I think I've written stories that I just knew they were one scene and that was all they were going to be. And this, I kept thinking about more scenes and I kept thinking about more ideas and more characters. And I think that was part of it too. Suddenly it was like, oh, what about this character? What about this character? What this person's boyfriend and this person's old friend and this person's best friend? And so there just seemed to, it became more populated by people and by scenes and ideas. And so it just kept growing and growing. So then I realized it was longer than a story.
Now that you have published a novel as well as short stories, do you feel that you have more of an affinity for short stories or novels, or is there a form that you find more exciting or challenging at this point?
I have to say, writing a novel, I'm so surprised to hear myself say this, but there was a lot of fun to it. I mean, there was definitely, about, yeah, I wouldn't have known. And it was also, as I said, it was tough too, but something about the expansiveness of it and being able to, I mean, you can do it in a short story too, of course. Short stories can cover many, many years and many scenes and many characters. That was hard for me to do in a short story. So in a novel, to be able to cover a period of time, and I'm already thinking about another novel that covers maybe even like 20 years. This was just a summer, but maybe something longer. And the fun of being able to do that over a longer work does feel exciting, very challenging, but also exciting. So I could see trying another novel, certainly linked stories, and maybe they become a novel. That's kind of what's
Yeah,
in my mind right now.
that'd be great. What does your process look like? I'm assuming was probably quite different for the novel versus when you're working on a short story. So maybe what was the novel process like? And what's your short story process like?
Um, for the difference for me, a lot of it had to do with stamina in a way.
Mm,
So when I was writing short stories, I found I could do it. I could take my notebook out and write in a coffee shop, or between appointments, let's say, or between classes, because I teach
mm,
classes, I could
mhm,
out the story and work on a paragraph or something. For the novel, I found that I needed to sit, even if I wasn't going to be writing for, 3 hours straight, I needed longer periods of time to concentrate.
mhm,
And I needed to have, I, maybe I'm just getting, because I'm older and my process is different, but I found that um, I needed to like go to sleep earlier and, sort of just to make sure I had the energy,
Yeah.
to just go through that whole long process, I guess. Um, and to be able to sit, yeah, for a long. So what I tried generally to do was to write in the mornings when I had free mornings. If I had free time in the afternoon, to do some revision. That was pretty much what my process is.
Mm.
Yeah. So the really focusing time in the morning.
So up in the morning to do a certain amount of writing and then consistently revising in the afternoon what you've worked on that morning, or sort of going back through and looking at everything. What does the afternoon revision look like?
Usually what I worked on that morning. And I usually in the morning would start with whatever chapter I was on, maybe rereading it and from the beginning. And I mean, I wouldn't go back to the beginning of the book, but maybe reading from the chapter and looking at that. I did a lot of outlining. I love to outline. I love to make charts. I love to organize.
Mhm.
So I did a lot of that. That was definitely a huge part of the work for me, which is probably the most fun part, because I love making chaos into order. I have about a bazillion calendar apps and productivity. I love that kind of thing. So notes
Mhm.
apps, things like that on my computer. So everything's color coded and all of that. So I spent a lot of time, but that was actually very helpful to say, what do I want to happen in this scene, and how does this scene fit into this chapter, and how does the chapter fit into the part of the book that it's in. So that was actually a lot of the process too. Oftentimes I would start with that, and then get writing on whatever I had sort of figured out was that day's writing.
Mm.
And then June, the revision was probably what I wrote that day, and trying to polish it and make it um, uh, something that I liked, that I was pleased with, that I was happy with as language.
When you are doing your outlining, does that come after some writing first and then kind of like seeing the chaos that's there and applying order to it? Or are you able to go from an outline?
Oh, definitely not from an outline,
Yeah.
but I didn't. do that whole, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, when they say like that, like shitty first draft, that
Oh, yeah, yeah.
you can cut that. But
Oh, no, that's
I didn't
fine.
do that. Okay. So I didn't do that because I couldn't write a whole first draft without, stopping and looking and thinking and all of that. So I think I wrote a few scenes is how I started. I'm trying to remember back to the process. I wrote a few scenes and then I started, I don't know if outlining is exactly the right word, but just sort of, I'm sure there's better words for it. I can't think of right now, but just starting to connect ideas, to
Mhm.
say, well, if this is going to start in her lobby, then where would she go from here? And then where would she be the next day? And does she have a summer job? And does she go to dinner with her parents? Just sort of
Mhm.
making connections like that. So it wasn't a straight outline like this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, but just sort of what are the scenes? There's a great book that I read. I now, of course, can't remember the writer. It was called From Where You Dream. I think it was a craft book,
Oh,
and he talks
Robert
about
Olin Butler.
Robert Owen Butler, wonderful book. And he talks
Mhm.
about that, just writing scenes on file cards, holding them very
Mhm.
loosely, both, mentally and even physically, and just kind of shuffling them around and see what might go where. So I did a lot of that too. Just taking scenes either on a computer or even writing them on file cards and just sort of loosely thinking like, where could this go? Where could this go? It took a long time actually to get the shape of the book. Um,
Mhm.
Once I had that, it was a little easier to fill things in.
Mhm.
Uh, I'd love to from an outline. I think that'd be so nice. I don't know how that would be possible I'm not sure I could do that. Yeah.
You also teach writing, and you
Mhm.
are the assistant director of the Writer's Studio in New York City. Can you talk a little bit about the Writer's Studio and what you do there?
Sure. So I teach fiction writing workshops there, and I also teach craft classes. And the method at the Writer Studio, which was sort of Philip Schultz, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet who is founded and is the head of the Writer Studio, came up with this method. He calls it persona writing, which is when you focus on the narrator in a work. So it could be first person, it could be third person, it could even be second person, who's telling the story and what's the personality of that narrator. So the fiction writing classes, we give exercises with different kinds of narrators, and then people try out those various narrators with their own material, learning different ways to tell a story. It's interesting. It's a good method, and then sort of the more you try out all these different narrators, the more you actually come to your own voice and own way of telling the story. So I teach those classes, and then we have a craft class once a week. Various different teachers teach that, where we take a book of short stories or an anthology or a novel, and teach that again, sort of focusing on who is the narrator. Is the narrator terse, or is the narrator lyrical, or is the narrator very wordy? Is a narrator an older narrator looking back on a time, or they write in the scene, things like that, and
Mhm.
just we sort of break apart the work, starting to look at it that way, and then look at it as writers, sort of what can we learn from this and what can we take from this. So, yeah,
That sounds great. Have you always
it's a
been,
really good method.
oh,
I'm sorry, what?
have you always been a writer?
I have, yeah, since I was very young. I still have it somewhere. My first writing contest that I won was like second grade. Not that I won so many writing contests, but one of the ones early ones was
Mhm.
I was in second grade. It was called Why Do Kangaroos Have Pouches? With a lovely illustration of a kangaroo. And it was a question answer format, which I think I came up with on my own. And that was second grade. So I know I was writing. It
Mhm.
was really cute. I know I was right. It was like, why do kangaroos have pouches for their little ones? That was the work. But yeah, so I've been writing since I was really young. I always loved to express myself. I love words also. And that was another thing when you came back to, or coming back to when you asked about the dedication to my parents. We had always had dictionaries around. We had, that dictionary stand people used to have. Do you remember there was sort of a podium and you'd have a
Mhm. Mhm.
dictionary open?
Mhm.
And so we had that. And my parents loved words. I mean, I taught tutored SATs for a while, and I would come home with what are those things called? This is like, this is to this, is this is to this. I can't remember the name, but I would come home with those and my mother and I would just go over them together. We loved them. We thought it was so much fun. So yeah, so I've always loved words. I've loved reading. I've loved writing since I was really young. I grew up in that kind of an atmosphere. I think that made a huge difference too. I was really lucky.
Then what was the road to publication like for you?
Um, so, as I said, I spent several years on this book and I submitted it to agents. I was really lucky. I got an agent relatively quickly. Of course, it felt like forever, but it was a couple of months. Um, and she submitted it. And the editor who liked it most, she and I had a conversation, a wonderful conversation about why she wasn't going to buy it, but why she really liked it, but was not going to buy it. Well, I mean, that is what she said. But we had this great conversation where she asked me several questions and said what she found most interesting in the book. And then I then spent another about 6 months revising it because I agreed with her. She's such a good editor, and she is my editor. It turned out she did buy the book, became my editor, and yeah, so that's how it went. So I feel like I had a really lucky and good experience. I love the people at Crown. It's everyone who worked on the book has helped me so much. The beautiful cover, wonderful editing. So it's been it's been a great experience. Yeah.
What has surprised you most about this experience of publishing and marketing a novel?
It's just another job. It's another job to do. It's a lot of work. But you know what? No, okay. I will say yes. It is a lot of work. It's a lot of being on social media in a way that I wasn't before because I'm very introverted and quiet and I like a lot of privacy. So that's definitely been very different. But in ways, it's actually been really interesting. I've met a lot of other writers this way. I've met a lot of bookstagrammers who like I love. Like there are people on Instagram who read, I think they read like a book a day. They're amazing. They love to read. They read so much. They love books. They love literature. So that's actually been lovely to see. And also, I've been driving around the Hudson Valley where I live, and I just sort of went around and introduced myself to various booksellers, and just the experience of going into so many different bookstores and meeting so many different booksellers has been really wonderful also. So part of it has been really fun. And but yeah, it's a lot of work too.
Is there anything you know now that you wish you had known when you started this process?
I guess the one thing I didn't know was how much time there was going to be between the sale of the book and the publication of the book.
Mm.
Um, it turned out for me to be almost a year and a half or so. I guess I sold the book in October and it's coming out in January. So that I honestly didn't know very much about publishing. I didn't know that books were all published on Tuesdays. Like I really knew very little. Is that right that all books are published on Tuesdays, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I didn't even know that. So there was a lot that I didn't know. So a lot of it has been a surprise to me, as you can see from the most sensible aspects of it. But
But
particularly
there's
the
no
amount of
reason you
time.
would know that, unless
I
you're.
guess, yeah, I guess that's true. All the bookstagrammers know that. They're always like, it's Tuesday, it's Tuesday. Everyone gets very excited. Uh, yeah, so I guess that's been a bit of a surprise. Yeah, yeah, I sort of didn't know. I didn't know how much. I just didn't know how much was involved. I didn't know how much copy editing was involved, and how much publicity and even the cover designs, and there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that I certainly didn't know, and there's a couple of books out about it. There's a really wonderful Courtney Mom book about it. I can't remember the name, but that she wrote about What's it
She's
called?
been
The
on.
Dancing.
She was just on recently.
Oh,
It's before and after the book
oh wow.
deal.
Yes, terrific book. And she demystifies a lot of it. But for me, even though I had read that book, I read that book years ago and read it again once I sold the book. And yet I think until I was involved in the process, actually, literally involved in the process, I still didn't quite get it.
Mhm.
A lot of different aspects. Yeah, although it's a terrific book, and she does a great service. She has a wonderful Substack too, which you probably talked about. That's just such a great resource for writers. Yeah.
What's your best advice for aspiring authors?
Um, Keep reading as much as possible. Just keep going. Um, Take yourself seriously, but not too seriously, maybe. um, and just believe that um, you have something to say that nobody else can say it in the way that you can say it. I think I told myself that a lot while I was writing my book. I just kept telling myself, I have something to say, and it took a while to figure out what I had to say. So I think that's
Mhm.
part of the writing process also. Um, but that I had something to say about, you know, being the child of a depressed person. I had something to say about, unrequited love or crushes on boys or all those, various themes in the book
Mhm.
that I had something to say about it that no one else could say, not because I'm so special, just because I've lived a different life than anyone else has. And everyone has, every writer has. So to think of it that way, to just that you have something to say and spend time figuring out what that is. Give yourself the space um, and the grace to figure out what it is you have to say and what it is you want to say.
I love that advice. We have a traditional last question on this podcast, and here it comes. When a gorgeous excitement becomes a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Oh God, this is such a cliche, but Madonna like a virgin. I don't know. I can't help myself.
It
It's
is
the right
perfect.
time. It's it's the right theme. And I do love that song.
It's a great song and it works perfectly.
I think that's what I would say, but there you go.
Cynthia Weiner, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It has been wonderful having the chance to talk with you.
Thank you. You too. I love the questions that you asked, and I love your responses, and it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.